surpass, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teachings. In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understanding of the teachings and practice, it is offered as a practice of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word, which means generosity or to give freely, and this is to be done without expectation or judgment when the opportunity arises. And those who share their teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis, so please support their practice by giving what you can. Our speaker today, Dr. Susan Lamb, has asked that her dana go to Great Tree, so you can go to the website and go on the upper right corner and click the donate button. So thank you very much. Our speaker today is Dr. Susan Lamb, who holds a PhD in clinical psychology from Vanderbilt. She was a practicing psychotherapist for more than 40 years. And for more than 2 decades, the focus of her attention has been the topic of desire on the life path. Susan has practiced with Teijo since the 1990s and has been a supporter of Great Tree since its beginning. Her Savannah Sangha is a group of associates of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. I have to tell you, a mouse has just walked up beside me. Oh, this is really something. This has never happened before. Okay. So if I scream in the middle of my talk, you will know what's happening. Woo. I will have to say my desire is for this mouse to go find somewhere else to be. Okay. I'm very happy to be with you this morning. Oh my gosh. This is unreal.
You need a cat?
Shoot away, shoot away.
This is crazy. We had some mouse traps set last night, and one of the mice, I think, got wounded, but not taken out. And so he's just crawling around. So here we go. Oh! Amazing. I bet you've never had this happen before either with a Zoom lecture. Okay, we'll see if we can focus here. All right. I will tell you how well, first of all, I'm so happy to be here and to see all of you there in the meditation hall. If it gets bad enough, I'm gonna call my husband to come down and help me, and you'll get to see the great chase. But maybe he will go away. So several decades ago, I embarked on this study of desire when I had been reading the novel called The Myths of Avalon, and the main character in the novel, who was Morgan Le Fay, who was the sister of Arthur, who later became, in the myth, King Arthur. And she had been raised in the House of Maidens and was devoted to the goddess culture. And she left the House of Maidens and went to her sister's home. She was slated to be, I guess, the abbess of the House of Maidens, but she deserted, and she was actually expecting a child at the time. And she also deserted, well, she left the child in the care of her sister and the servants in the household. So I found this a distressing set of circumstances, that the ways of the goddess culture, including respect for desire as a force, that those were not to be taken forward. They were not to be taught to her child or the others in her society. So to cope with my distress, I started journaling, and I imagined that I was dialoguing with her child and teaching him what I knew. I didn't know I was going to talk about desire with him, but as I was just trying to teach him anything I knew that I thought might have been part of the goddess culture, and happened on the topic of desire and never left it. So pretty quickly, when I started trying to learn what I could about desire, I learned that a positive function of desire, even though I was quite aware that on our Eastern spiritual paths, we're taught that desire is, well, the attachment to desire is the root of all suffering. I believe that was the Buddha's teaching. So I was aware that there was a lot of pain that came with desire, but also became aware that the positive function of desire was that it triggered our life force energies and focused them so that um, we could do all kinds of things based on focusing our life energies. But then also very quickly, as I began watching desire with my clients and with myself, I could see this suffering that the Buddha was warning us about. I have a couple of little stories from my own life that show that pain of desire. One had to do, I think when I first started talking about desire and got to speak in the lecture series, I told the story that my son, who was then, I believe, 18 years old when he had completed a renovation project in the carriage house behind our house, and he wasn't quite ready to quit doing projects on our home, so he wanted to do a garden. So I certainly had wanted a garden for a long time, but had not been able to have the garden because that little courtyard was needed for basketball goals, rabbits, all kinds of things. And he's very attracted to our lecture series here, I have to say. It's amazing. There's a whole house, and he's choosing this spot. Woo! Go on, go, go. That's amazing. Woo. Okay. So we went for a walk around on a Saturday morning, and I wish you could see him. Maybe I'll move the computer so you can see him too. He's pretty cute. If frightening, he's so cute. So we went for a walk around town, and we live in downtown Savannah, where there are some beautiful courtyards, and you can see them through the garden gates. And we were to choose what elements we wanted in our garden. And we we chose ideas like that there would be multiple levels in the garden. There'd be a sunken part with a fountain and those kinds of things. But that was all in the abstract. When we got back, we sat down in the mounds of dirt that were still there from when it had been where rabbits lived. And it was time to start talking about how we were going to do this. And suddenly I was overcome with I was aggravated that my son was wanting me to do this, something that I had always wanted. I felt like just being angry with him. I will say that the garden did get created. Somehow there were enough resources, or among those of us in the family, we did create the garden. But I will always remember that feeling of rage. And then the other incident was I had decided very early that I wanted to be a psychologist. I heard a patient at a state hospital when I went to visit a relative as a teenager. I heard a patient howling and was just so amazed by that expression of pain that I wanted to learn everything I could and offer what I could to ease that suffering. So, it took a bazillion years to do all the study and the practice. And I knew that I wanted to practice with a group of people, like-minded therapists, in a Victorian house in downtown Savannah. And eventually the time came. We found the house. We had the group of like-minded therapists. We had a contractor to do the renovations on the house. And I was sitting with a friend who was an architect who was going to help us plan. And I didn't so much feel angry that time, but I just felt so frightened and scared. And I would have rather been anywhere than in that room with her, trying to answer her questions. So again, you have the pain that gets triggered at the very beginning. And of course, that's just the beginning. It continues all through the process of creating what we desire. So I found a myth about desire and consciousness that, again, sort of illustrated this. So I'll tell you that story. It's the story of Parvati and Shiva. Parvati being a symbol of the energy of desire, and Shiva being a symbol primarily of consciousness in this myth. So Parvati, from the day of her birth, dreams of this meditating figure on a mountaintop in zazen sitting position. And she's so drawn to him. She wants to know him. She wants to relate to him. She wants to partner with him. So as time goes on through her childhood and her teenage years, this continues. And finally, as she comes of age, she calls on what was called a kama. I think kama in Sanskrit actually means desire, but he's a Cupid-like figure. And she calls on him to come and help her. And she tells him about her dreams. And he says to her, "Oh, I know exactly who that is. That is Shiva. I know where he is sitting. You are meant for him." Now, that's an interesting clue right there. You are meant for him, not he's meant for you, which, we'd sort of expect. She's the one having the dreams. But the comment says, more or less, you're being called to him. So we get to ask now, why would consciousness need desire? We already had a pretty good idea why desire needed consciousness to trigger life force energies and focus them. But why does consciousness need desire? And as the story goes on, we'll get some clues. So the Kama agrees to take Parvati to Shiva. They get in his carriage and go to the Mount Kailas, where Shiva is meditating. And Parvati hides behind a large stone, and Shiva sits there as the Kama goes to him. And the Kama disturbs him and says, I have here someone who wants to meet you. It is the lovely maiden Parvati. Shiva opens his eyes, and turns out Shiva is also the the god of destruction, which you may know if you know yogic philosophy, the god of destruction, as well as god of consciousness. And so he turns to the Kama and says, you would tempt me with a beautiful maiden? And emits a bolt of lightning from his third eye, which immediately reduces the Kama to ashes. So we see there that this pain of desire, which, I think when each of us individually feel the pain of desire, we tend to think it's just us, that it's our own deficits. But we see here that here it is in an ancient myth that consciousness turns and destroys the messenger who comes to bring Parvati, who is the goddess of desire. So again, we're left asking why? What is that? As I have recently discovered, reading the Pema Chodron book, Welcoming the Unwelcome, she has this illustration here of 3 concentric circles. And this comes from some psychologists, a Soviet psychologist, Blavatsky, back in the 30s. And it's a pretty self-evident kind of thing that the middle circle, he said, is our comfort zone. That's where we like to hang out. The circle around it is the learning zone or the challenge zone. And then on the far side is the excessive risk zone. So I guess the idea is that, as Pema describes it, we all like to hang out watching Netflix, she says, and eating peanut butter sandwiches, doing things that are not challenging to us. And even Shiva, the god of consciousness. So now we have to see him not as fully developed, all-consuming consciousness, but as developing consciousness. That there is something that would rather not be disturbed by what would take us out of that comfort zone into the learning zone. And as soon as we take first movement toward a desire, most likely we run into our own resistance, because even though we want whatever this is, this experience, this creation, there's also a part of us that doesn't want to leave our comfort zone. We don't want to have to learn what we don't know yet. We don't want to have to find resources that we don't have yet. And in fact, if what we desire is in that outer circle, we probably aren't ready. We probably have to bring the desire in a bit so that it's just outside the comfort zone. In Chinese medicine, we can sort of think of this also as the heart, that the pericardium channel in Chinese medicine, the heart protector, is charged with keeping the heart safe as a place for spirit to dwell. And I guess as we push the boundaries of the heart protector, it creates pain, it creates fear, it creates rage. So our story, I wanted to mention also, in the early days of my trying to learn about desire and the pain of desire, there was a best-selling book called The Prayer of Jabez. Jabez was a character that appeared in a list of begats, and I think it was Chronicles in the Bible. So-and-so begets, so-and-so begets, so-and-so who beget Jabez. And Jabez prayed this prayer: "O Lord, that you would enlarge my boundaries, but take my hand that I may do no harm." Because in the pain of desire, we can actually hurt others with our anger and jealousy, as well as hurting ourselves. So as our story continues, Parvati runs out from behind her rock and she protests to Shiva. She says, "What have you done? You have destroyed this messenger who was just doing what I asked him to do. Those who are meant for you should not, should be met with respect and welcome, not with this disrespect and destruction." So Shiva, he's pretty amazed because, being the god of destruction, the celestials around him don't often protest and disagree with him. Oh, he's taken with her courage. And then as he watches, she arranges herself beside him. And he says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "If I am to be with you, I must do as you do." So in other words, if she is attracted to consciousness and is called by consciousness, then she has to develop consciousness. She has to practice as Shiva is practicing. Desire and consciousness must abide side by side. She claims her space there with consciousness. And again, Shiva is amazed. He laughs. Like, he's delighted then that she wants to practice beside him. And what we learn is that Shiva, before Parvati joins him, is inert. He's without motion. But once she joins him, there's all this energy and motion. And we can see that this is why the Kama says you are meant for him. That if we, on this life path, are to, you hear people call this life school. If we are to learn what we're here to learn, it is to be done in the three-dimensional world. It is to be done in the world of creation. So Shiva does need Parvati in order to move out of that inert comfort zone. What the explanation of the diagram tells us is that if we don't push against those boundaries, then the comfort zone shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, so that you have people who are giving into their fears, who eventually won't leave their home, who eventually won't leave their room, who eventually won't leave their bed. So we want to keep moving against those tight protective boundaries. And I have a few illustrations from my experience with clients where people were not pushing against those boundaries. I had a teacher that I'll call Janice, who came in one summer when she was not working. She was so frustrated with herself because all she would do is watch TV and eat. And she was getting larger and larger. And there were things that she had wanted to do at the beginning of the summer. She was a music teacher. She played the violin, and she wanted to learn a new sonata. She wanted to paint some of the rooms in her home. But she was so accustomed to not acting on her desires that she couldn't make her do even those tasks. It turned out that she is a talented violinist. Her dad, she grew up in Mississippi, and her dad was just certain that she was going to be Miss Mississippi in the Miss America contest. And I guess something knew that was outside even the learning zone. And then the college president where she went to college was just certain that her violin performance was going to put his college on the map. So it was the same thing. These demands, these expectations were so high, and she'd gotten so accustomed to just closing out her own desires that she couldn't make herself do anything. And she was probably a good teacher. She could meet the expectations of being a good teacher, but not the things that were her own personal life. And then there was one more extreme case. This one also a musician. I find that musicians and artists it's easier for us to see the principles about desire at work because they are more likely to be dependent on their own desires to move forward in their professions. This person is a gentleman named Lee, and he was a pianist who was so resistant to his own desires and his mother's desires for him to be an excellent pianist that he didn't practice in a consistent, regular way. And so he would just practice right before performances and developed all kinds of injuries that were based on the those muscles not being strong enough to support that amount of practice. And what he described to me was that he developed the habit of missing planes and trains that he had tickets for. And this was in the days where if you missed your flight, you could just take a later one. But his disability with regard to desires was such that he couldn't even really see the things that needed to be done around him to keep his life orderly and his space orderly until right before time to leave for the airport or the train station. And then he'd see what he needed to do. And he would jump up and work so hard to do it that he'd lose track of time and miss the flight or the train. And then there also are emotions that get triggered, like the anger and the fear that struck me in those two situations I told you about. Had a client who he grew up in a small South Georgia town where his sexual identity would not have been acceptable, and he felt lots of depression at not being himself. And so as an adult, even once he came out, he would find each time he entered a social situation that that old pattern of exhausted depression would rear its head, and he would find it difficult to interact with people in the situation. So anger, jealousy, depression, and then these patterns of not being able to see what needs to be done, not being able to motivate oneself to do the things one wants to do if Parvati is not taking her place beside consciousness, is not confronting the patterns that need to be confronted. So then we can ask, do these same kinds of things happen on a temporary basis if we are paying attention to our desires, if we are partnering, if desire in us is partnering with consciousness, if we are practicing. And as you might guess, yes, they do. They do show up temporarily. A client named Marissa, who was a visual artist, had almost given up on getting the training that she needed as a fine art painter. But she discovered, and she was giving up on it because she had married early and had children and had a family to support. But then she discovered that she could work in the art school and have access to courses. And eventually she moved on to graduate. In the meantime, she also was in psychotherapy and in her own, just helping herself. She was discovering how to overcome the patterns that were established in her childhood, where her father always told her whatever she wanted to do, she couldn't do. She was, learning to question that. And so she married again, and her husband was better at asking for what he needed toward his desires than she was. And he had her take him to hike part of the Appalachian Trail, and then she was to come back later and do part of it with him. And in a phone call, he told her that he thought that the part they were going to do together was too hard for her, and so that she should come and pick him up, take him to the part of the trail he wanted to do, just hang out for several days doing nothing, and then come back and pick him up, or come back and join him for a part that he thought she could do. And she was so enraged at just being a vehicle for his desires that temporarily she lost touch with what it was she even wanted. He said, when she got quiet and wasn't participating in the conversation, and he asked, well, what do you want? She said she went numb. She couldn't even find it. Eventually she did, over the course of some days, because she was intent on overcoming that pattern, dissolving that pattern of not knowing what she wanted. And then I have an example from my own life early on in my professional career, sitting with a group of colleagues and describing some concept that I thought I was discovering, and looking around and seeing blank faces, like they weren't understanding. And I remember how angry I felt that they weren't understanding what I was trying to describe. But in contemplating that later, realizing, if we want to break new ground for ourselves and maybe for others, that of course there are going to be blank stares, because we're in unfamiliar territory, and we have to grow in our ability to do what we want to do. So, just to review, that we know that desire focuses our life energies and gives us energy to do what is ours to do. And we know that the teachings are correct, that desires can be the root of great suffering, because in order to move toward those desires, we have to push against the heart protector. We have to push against the boundary of our comfort zone into the area of the learning zone. We know if we don't do that, the comfort zone shrinks, it gets smaller and smaller. We're less and less able to find our desires and act on them. And even if we do find our desires and act on them, we're going to find ourselves in the pain of desire. We're going to find ourselves frightened, jealous, angry, all kinds of things. And we need our practice. I greatly admire the determination, the commitment that you have at Great Tree to practice. And we need our practice if we're going to be on a path where we honor our desires. I thought we would finish up today by doing a short practice together. And I thought we would use Tonglen, because I know that's it's a practice that you do at Great Tree, and it's a practice I love. You may be more schooled in Tonglen than I am, but I thought we would practice this morning for a few minutes using Tonglen with the pain of desire. So as you probably know, in Tonglen, at least one of the ways to practice it is to find our own suffering, our own difficulty, and to breathe that in. When we when we talk about the comfort zone shrinking because we're not facing what happens with us in the course of moving toward desire. I've forgotten what the end of that sentence was. I'll just do another sentence. So there's always that, we always are running into the pain of desire. and we need to be present with it. We need to be present with it in our practice. And we know that it is common to human beings because we all know we've experienced it ourselves, and it appears in our myths. So this is something that is normal, that is part of being on a path where we honor our desires. So in Tonglen, we use our own suffering to make us aware of the suffering of others. And as we breathe in that suffering for ourselves and others, and the end of the sentence was, way back there, that then we breathe out relief, release, as we breathe in the darkness of pain or fear. And I sort of think of it as taking it into our hearts, where it can be transformed through our compassion into light, into release, into relief. So take your position, that same position that Parvati took beside Shiva, and take a few mindful breaths. And then look first in your life today to see if there are desires that you have backed away from because it was too painful, too frightening. You found yourself being too jealous, too angry. Or perhaps you're tempted to back away because it's too hard. You don't know how to proceed. And now breathe in the darkness of those emotions or that confusion. If there's not a current one, you can use a past one. Several breaths. Now just breathe in. I think Pima sometimes says, locate that feeling, that pattern. Breathe it into the heart. And then invite the light on the out breath. And then on the next few breaths, breathe in the darkness of the pattern. Breathe out the light of release and relief. And then let yourself be aware of the millions of people, millions of human beings who are right now experiencing the same pain, the same confusion. Breathe in their suffering, their confusion, along with your own, their darkness, along with your own. And breathe out the light of your compassion for them, as well as for yourself. And in our last moments, last minutes of this practice, if there are ideas that are ready to come about next steps that you can take in the midst of confusion, in the midst of the discomfort, just make note of those. And then we'll bring ourselves back. I don't have a bell to ring, but we'll just bring ourselves back and maybe gasho to each other. And we have about 10 minutes, I think, for if you have comments or questions that you want to throw out for us to consider. This is our time to do that. Thank you for bearing with me while I scooted around and tried to avoid the mouse. All right, questions, comments?
Um, just wanted to say thank you. I really appreciated what you shared, and especially the myth. It was really, I like learning in that way. So I really appreciated all of your teaching.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, you were speaking about the pain of desire sort of on the side of you know, the pain involved in leaving your comfort zone, or the pain involved in trying something new, or you know, sort of the more agoraphobic side of that pain. But um, I feel like there's this other part of pain from desire, which is the opposite side of the spectrum, which is like the striving, the always wanting more, you know, like the you know, no sense of satisfaction, right? The sort of grasping side of it. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, and how, you know, how to be careful not to get too far into either side of it.
Yeah. Well, of course, you're right. You know, what I have realized in working on these ideas is that in our culture, we have the literature and the internet is full of people who are practicing going for desires to conquer the world, and we know that in a sense there's never enough. If we take at face value those desires, but if we're using our desires on a path toward awakening, which is, the way I've come to think of it, that desire can be a path toward awakening, then we have to notice what it is in us that is not satisfied. I don't know about you, but I've had experiences where I would push past the discomfort and do things that were really hard, and then the minute they were done, I was dissatisfied with them. Not because there was anything wrong with what I had done, but because it wasn't enough. I didn't get paid enough, or I'd had to work too hard for the small amount of satisfaction. Like that critical voice was in there saying, you're not enough. What you've done is not enough. What you've gotten is not enough. And of course, then Parvati has to sit down beside Shiva and practice with that and be present with it and see where that takes us, because you're so right. I remember my son, the same one who wanted to create the garden, he came home from his early days in medical school saying, I learned that if you look at people who win the lottery and people who have an accident and become paraplegic, that at first, the people who win the lottery are so happy, so satisfied. The people who have become paraplegic are terribly unhappy and hopeless. But that over time, each group returns to their previous level of happiness. The lottery winners are no happier than they were before they won the lottery, and the paraplegics are as satisfied with their lives as they were before they became paraplegic. So it's like, it's all about consciousness, isn't it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
It seems to me that a lot of that fear, for me, when you were talking about it, I thought, I have a good idea and then it's time to do it. And then, there's the unknown,
Yeah.
there's I don't know if I can do this. I don't know how to do this. And of course,
Yeah.
that's the magic of it, really.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
kind
and
of,
there's the unknown of, what if I can do it? Where will it take me? Do I want to go there?
yeah, right. Am I able to go there?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing I was thinking about at the beginning, and I still haven't quite got this formed in my head, but you said something about suffering is caused by the attachment to desire. And then I was thinking, desire is kind of what causes the attachment. Do you think that's true?
Okay, I'm having trouble with hearing you, Teijo. I don't know if
Can you turn up the audio?
Like, not really.
No, going to the audio.
If I brought it over here, would it help?
It's not even connected to that microphone anymore. It's pretty sketchy.
Yeah, I think maybe output.
It's not output, it's input, but let's
Try
try.
pulling up the outputs. Are we?
Can you repeat her question? I can hear you.
you.
Try again.
Okay. So, when you said that desire, that attachment to desire creates suffering. Did you hear what I said?
I said that, was that about the attachment to desires being the root of suffering?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I was thinking is that desire creates attachment.
Desires create the
Attachment.
suffering?
Attachment.
Attachment. Yeah.
This microphone's not working.
You know, one of the ways I think about that is that if we're aware that our primary desires are our own awakening, then then we don't have to be so attached to whatever the specific desire is. That's one way I try to be with that. And I guess it's like attachments in general, that it's part of our movement toward awakening, that we feel our desires, we decide which ones we're moving toward. But we stay open to what we can learn about ourselves and the process of awakening as we go, rather than thinking it's that particular thing that we have to have.
It seems like it's hard to think about awakening without kind of defining it.
Well, awakening itself is our desire, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And an attachment, if we think about a specific thing. And it seems like openness is kind of more to the point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think many of our questions about desire are they really are questions that we live with. I love the idea that questions we can't answer yet, we are to love, and in time perhaps we will move toward the answers.